many of which are indeed classics by themselves. So what, according to you, is a literary classic of the world? What is just 2 to 3 minutes of this?
Basically, that's clearly everything that I want to say because basically, Beirut has said most of the things that I wanted to say. In the sense that we are talking about literary works or paintings or whatever, works of art that have durability, that will outwit time. And you know, they spread themselves across generations of people. Sometimes they spread themselves across centuries, not sometimes. Very often, the great classics are as old as maybe 1,000 years, 500 years, etc., etc. And I think they have a remarkable ability to find or to offer new meanings to changing generations. You know, what the kind of meanings and significance that Shakespeare's supplied to people of the 16th century. I'm sure they still work for people of the 21st century. I think that is why these works live on, because they are not affected by time, affected by changing values, changing perceptions. So I suppose we use that good old word, perennial values. I mean, which is rather shabby, but I suppose that is what it means. Like, what are the perennial values? It's difficult to say, but I suppose truth must be one, beauty must be one, love must be one, brotherhood must be one, etc., etc. So I think, and human tragedy as a whole, if you think that humanity, that there is an element of tragedy in birth, living and death and departures, and so if there is a tragic element to humanity, then most of these great works reflect that tragedy also. This is what it is.
They reflect the tragedy, but they also help us overcome the tragedies sometimes. The true classic.
Yeah, certainly. It is. They tell you, I mean, in many of the great works, despite the tragedies, how people rise above, rise. Not just saying that, giving, surrender.
So thank you for that. It's a very appropriate way of understanding the classics. And I'd like to ask Nirmala, you have approached the literary world through different perspectives. As an academic in the cultural space, as the director of the National Trust, as a multilingual translator, many languages. Through your association with the publishing world, the K.K. Birla Foundation, what are your views? What makes a classic? How do we recognize? RJ?
Thank you, Namita. Actually, Paul complained that most of the things have been already said by Srinath. No, I complain that what will still remain, that is been said by Paul. So, but I'd like to begin by making a subtle distinction between classical literature and classics. You know this. Often we use this term, we interchange it in literature. But actually, these two mean two different things. By classical literature, we generally mean literature of the ancient period of Greek and Roman great writers of Homer, Virgil, Ovid, and all the playwrights of the time, and also other literature, pastorals, ballads, lyrics of masterpieces of other ancient civilizations, as referred to by Monta in the case of Gilgamesh. And by classics, you mean that the book of abiding interest, which is lived through the times. And generally speaking, books that have a timeless quality are considered to be in the category of classics. Great works of literature touch readers to their very core. I think this is the most important part of a classic. it touches reader to the very close. As a matter of fact, it touches life. It changes the reader's mentality. It changes the reader's perception of history. Because after reading, let's say, War and Peace, your perception of history of Russia will be totally different from what you have been told by the textbooks of history. So these three classic, and then as Paul Zakaria said, you mentioned brotherhood, you mentioned truth, beauty, but I would like to include more conditions of life and more lived experiences like love, hate, death, like faith, sin, piety. So one of the greatest classics is crime and punishment. The two terms, crime and punishment, apparently are very related terms. It has nothing to do with truth and beauty, but then ultimately it transcends and it leads us towards the truth and beauty. I think this is what I would think consider. But and at the same time, I would also like to mention that sometimes, there are books which may not be generally considered a classics by a discerning reader. But within a genre, it may be considered a classics. Like say Stephen King's that haunted house book. For us, it may not be a classics, but one who is studying the horror as a genre, for him it is a classics.
I think each of you has added so much to the definition of what is a classic in Indian writing and in international writing. And now over to Rana Nair. You're an academic, you're a prolific translator, you translated 14 modern classics from Punjabi to English, have a deep commitment to theatre and your own creative and critical writing. So in your booming theatre voice, you wake us all up and tell us what, according to you, is a classic.
Thank you, Namitaji. This question, in fact, has been bothering me for a long time. And I don't really think I have any conclusive answers to offer. You know, when we reflect on this question, what is a classic? Yesterday I was in a session where Linda Hess raised a very important question. They were again deliberating over literary classics, world classics to be precise. And she says that let us start looking for, because in India we deal with 24 languages. Of course, we deal with many more, but I'm talking about the languages which are there in the constitution, in the scheduled list. So she says that let's start looking for words which actually can bring us very close to the understanding of a classic. And I think that set me thinking. You have mentioned Carl Jay, but I wonder if Carl Jay actually represents or comes very close to capturing the spirit of what a classic is. Reason why I say that is very simple. If we look into the etymology of the word classics, Kanti Bhattacharya ji made a very fine distinction between classical literature and classics. I think we can look at three terms. One is classic, the other is classics, where we had to add definite article the, and the classical literature. All of them have common origin in the word class. And if I may refresh your memory, it was only in 17th century that this term classique, which originally was used in French, actually became part of critical parlance. Before that, there was no mention of classics, and there was no discussion on classics. After it came into French, it traveled into English. And then, of course, we had a French thinker saying, you, I don't really know how to pronounce his name because it's a typical French name. So he wrote an essay, What is a Classic? And that initiated a discussion, which was carried forward by people like Metcalfe, T.S. Eliot, so on and so forth. But my point is that let us look for indigenous
Of
terms
course.
and try and locate this entire discourse in our own language.
Yes, but I think it is understood here that when we are saying literary classics of the world and Indian writing, we have already moved in most parts of the world beyond the 19th century or the colonial times, and we have appropriated these words and are using them in our own context. So I don't think we need to go back to the historical context of academia here.
Sure.
And we are really short of time, that's why I have to cut you short. I'm
No,
really
no,
sorry.
perfectly fine.
But we begin once again because now we go a little deeper into the subject. And when we go deeper into the subject, there are three questions, not 7 to 8 minutes, because I thought this was a longer thing. A general view, what does a classic mean to you? What are the criteria by which you evaluate the concept of classic? What is a classic in the context of your area of interest study and literary specialization? For example, you have done so much work in Punjabi. It will be fascinating to see what you look at as a classic there. But I'm not beginning with you. I'm beginning with our classic here, which is Mr. Paul Zakaria. And I'm also requesting each of you to, this is spontaneous, so this is not like some class teacher giving you, once you can say what you like. Whatever of these questions you remember, but I would like you to list out three classics across cultures, across continents. At least one of them should be from India, and they could all be from India if needed. Somebody could help Paul put his phone off. Not at all. So Paul will begin with you, keeping in mind all the very deep questions that have been raised by the other three. Hold the mic close to you.
So, as I see, I am a fiction writer in India, in Malayalam. And see, the fiction has a very short history. It's about 124 years old. Yeah. So, if we talk about technology, is very hard. If we talk about longevity, like say, European authors going on for 500 years, 1,000 years, etc., etc. Malayalam actually has no standing. Malayalam fiction is just 123 years old. Because the first novel came at the turn of the century, 19th century. But I think the man who started writing fiction in Malayalam and made it fit there and made it happen and made it, gave us a beginning. That's why people like me are standing here. That man's name was C.V. Raman Pillai. He wrote 2-3 historical novels, which when we look back today in democratic times, maybe not really very, not in terms of its approach, because it's a royal family history where he is very reverential to a royal family, etc., etc. But it is, these books are his books like Marthandavarma are so brilliant. I wouldn't have been a writer if I hadn't read these books when I was, because my father had these books at home. So I must have read them 20 times minimum when I was 10 or 13. So this is one man I would refer to as a classic in terms of longevity and in terms of influence on what happened after. But after him, great writers have appeared, like O.V. Vijayan. like Tagari Shivashekar Pillai, people like that, remarkable, extraordinary writers. But I'm not being cynical when I say that we have to still wait to see if they turn into classics. Say 100 years from now, will we be remembering these remarkable, beautiful writers? We don't know. Maybe. But will Malayalis be remembering them? I'm not talking about the world or about India. But will they be doing that? You see, but poetry has, I will quickly say this, poetry has a much longer history in Malayalam, which is 500 years, starting with Ezhuthachan, who translated the Mahabharata and the Ramayana into Malayalam. And they remain unbroken chain of, remain as classics till today, basically because they have a very strong literary reputation, as also they are religious classics. And in fact, when Ezhuthachan translated Ramayana and Mahabharata from Sanskrit to Malayalam, he laid the foundation of what became later the modern Malayalam language. This was in the 16th century. So these two are the books I would, apart from C.V. Raman Pillai's fiction works, these are the two books I would refer to as classics in my language, which has a very short life. It's a I don't know, language is Bacha or Bachi in Hindi. It's a baby language. It's a baby language. So in our language, these are the three books I would refer to as the.
That was most enlightening, and I was just trying to look up, was it Chiang Kai-shek? Who was it? Who was Mao Zedong's number two? No, not Chiang Kai-shek, Mr. Taiwan, but you know what I'm saying. Chow Enlai. So when Kissinger asked Chow Enlai, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said to him, replied, it's too early to tell. So it's a bit like that with classics, I guess. And now, I was wondering who we would like to, I think let's clear the right-hand side before we come to the left, the much vilified left. So as a rightist, come ahead on the stage, Srinath. And unless you'd like to sit and talk, whichever is more comfortable now. This is us and let's have fun talking, no stress, not even time stress. We can go up by a few minutes.
I must admit that there is a part of me that is skeptical about classics as well. Probably because I didn't study literature in college or anything. So I read desultorily, and I've read books, from here and there, and try to patch together my literary awareness. And so I've always been conscious that while classics emerge from societies and cultures filtered through the ages, they also carry with them perhaps the same limitations that societies and cultures have. So, the Tamil retorts to the Ramayana, for example, where Ravana wins against Rama. And of course, the number of people who can't relate to a classic or an epic is in every part of the world. So, I would like to think about the option of there being classics which are also personal. And you may come to a book first by chance, not in the canonized order or anything. And so I'd like to talk about one such book that is quite recent. So it is because classics are also created not only by communities and cultures, but also because there are critics whose form of expression it is to define a canon. There are publishers who start series of their classics, and there is a pleasure to read them uncritically sometimes. So I want to talk about a fairly recent book in Kannada, and this also happens to be related to what I'm doing at the moment. I'm working on a story about wildlife, and there's this book released in 1980 called Garbalo, written by Purvachitra Tejasvi. It's a hugely popular book, celebrated in
Could you repeat the name? I couldn't get it.
the think this is no, okay. The book is called Karvalu, the name. It's a name. And it's written by Purna Chandra Tejasvi. Purna Chandra Tejasvi. So it's hugely well known. But again, it's too recent. It came out in 1980, so maybe one doesn't think of it in terms of being a classic. But what I spoke about classics having a force field. So the book had that kind of effect on me in the sense that it's about man and nature, about how man tries to modify, make use of nature, bend it to his will. But nature has a say and fights back almost always. And much of his other work is also in a similar way. And when I do projects now which involve, ecology and the environment, so that becomes a sort of filter. That book has defined lens for me through which I look at these things. So in my view, it is a classic for me. I think while classics are real and there, we should also allow some margin for people to define their own classics. For example, in the US, an author like Ayn Rand, for example, whom I think many people are infatuated by when they're younger and then sometimes grow out of, has been incredibly influential in that there are people in government who sort of found their libertarian principles through her writing, and then even if they became more sophisticated in terms of their economics, I think it sort of shapes the view of looking at the world which doesn't necessarily go away. I also want to talk about this, how the classics of the world and Indian writing they come together, and in the process, maybe I will name 2 or 3 classics. So I was the first lockdown. I was sitting in Dharamshala translating Girish Karnad's autobiography. And the thing is, sometimes there isn't enough information especially with nonfiction. There isn't enough information when someone is writing about the real world to translate it into another language. So we need to go back to what they're writing about. So when it comes to the part where he writes Yayati around 1960, I think. And then the kinds of influences he had when he wrote that. So for one, he was in Mumbai and he was watching Ibrahim Alkazi's productions of Antigone. And this was the Anoi's version of Antigone, which was, again, he took the Sophocles play and then he recast it in the context of World War II. So he watched this, and Alkazi had these women acting in it who influenced Girish deeply. And at the same time, he was reading the Mahabharata, and he came upon Yayati's story. I don't know if Khandekar's version was also out at around the same time, and that might have had some sort of subliminal influence on him. And he thought of the kind of female characters he saw in Anu's interpretation. He thought of adding one such character to the story from the Mahabharata. And so we have, I think, Chitralekha, I think that's her name. So we have a sort of talking back that happens within the story of Yayati. And this also becomes a personal expression for him, because he's on the cusp of leaving for Oxford, and his parents have certain expectations of him. They're urging him not to go there and get married to a white woman. They're urging him to return and take care of them. And he feels that this has something in common with these unreasonable demands, between Guru and Yayati. And so all of this comes together into one play. And the idea for me here is that not only does this result in a new play, maybe it's too early to say Yayati is going to be considered a classic or not, but it refreshes the Mahabharata and it refreshes Antigone for us. And that is, I think, the power of classics, that they keep reinventing themselves through other actors down the ages.
Can we request little silence or shouting over? So it's very true what you said about minor classics, individual classics, cult classics, as Nirmali also mentioned, that Stephen King is also a classic, and also gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers who make classics deservedly or undeservedly. Also, this very important point of how the classics survive despite all odds. They are like the turba grass that revives every time some water is thrown on them, and how they continue to be reinterpreted and to be in conversation with each other. So each of them gains. And that indeed is the case with myth and epic and legend in this country, where they are always new. So that was very enlightening. And now I'd like to turn to you, if you don't mind, being next in the line, to tell us about, continue some of the conversations which I so sharply cut you short, which I apologize for, and the train of thought about what is a classic in your context of interest. Three classics, you've 14 Punjabi classics, so what do you see as a classic? How do you place the religious texts in that? The anthology of poetry that was the core of the world's youngest religion. All these things.
Thank you, Namitaji, for giving me yet another opportunity to put my views across. And you made my task much easier by actually giving me three. You want me to talk about three different cultural texts. I want to make a few preliminary observations before I come to three texts which can be regarded as classics in our own culture, that is Punjabi. My first observation is that no author ever sets out with the assumption that he is going to create a classic. I was wondering if Shakespeare ever thought that he would be read 500 years or 600 years after he was no more. I was also thinking whether Dante ever thought that his trilogy would become an eternal classic and a kind of a reference point, not only in Italian culture, but also in world literature. Dante was grappling with two things at that point of time, if I remember correctly. He was obsessed with a woman called Beatrice, whom he loved intensely and whom he lost. So he was trying to overcome this sense of loss. That was one thing. Somehow he got involved with the nitty-gritty of politics of his times, and he was extremely unhappy. He even had to go to jail when he was fairly young. All that, I think, prompted him to just do some kind of a work in which he could talk about his love, he could talk about his times, and he could talk about dissatisfaction that he had with the kind of politics that was being practiced in Italy at that point of time. When I reflect on this, I think one answer that I get is, with the exception of Srinath mentioned Mahabharata, I just want to take you in a different dimension. In my little reading, I'm not a well-read man, in my little reading, I've come across only one work where an author is making a claim that he's actually going to create a classic, and that is Mahabharata. Vedya says, I'm creating literary cosmos. जो इस संसार में है वो सब महाभारत में है और जो महाभारत में नहीं है वो संसार में भी नहीं है. Not many authors, writers, where their soul can actually hope to make that kind of a claim. But otherwise, I think it is time. Srinath mentioned critics tell us how a classic is made. Canon making is there, but I feel the ultimate critic is time. Let us accept that. Anything which outlives us, our lifetime, which lives on. I remember once I was talking to Lalit, a Punjabi writer, and I asked her exactly the same question that Namita ji has posed me. I said, Tivana ji, you've had a long experience. Please tell me, what are the special attributes of a great work? You're always trying to figure it out, trying to understand, make sense of it. You know, she was so succinct about it. She said, and I would put it in Punjabi because there is no other way in which I can put it. She said, Rana jeda June yoga hoega, oh great work. That means the work has to have inherent capability or capacity to be able to live on. I'm only underlining the point that all the speakers have already made. But the question arises, what is it that makes a work live on? क्या हम उसमें कुछ खास डाल रहे हैं? मुझे लगता है 3-4 चीजें। एक तो क्लासिक क्रिएट करने के लिए आपको लिटरेरी ट्रेडिशन चुनती है। It's not that you understand literary tradition, but to my mind, if Sophocles came at a certain point of time, or Dante was able to do what he did, or Shakespeare wrote what he did, you're talking about comparison between Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. That's very important. It's in order, and we've been talking about it informally and even in academic forums. The point is that you're chosen to write a classic, which means you don't choose to write, but you're chosen. You are the chosen one. You are special. And you happen to be there at a certain juncture in history. Now, this is exactly what brings me to my understanding of a classic. Srinath mentioned Italo Calvino. My thoughts go back to the same word. Why read classics? Apart from several other reasons that he gives, he says classic is a cultural text in which culture resides as well as resonates. It has to live on. The entire culture is living through a single text. So therefore, classical writer or one who is able to write a classic is chosen by the forces unknown to me. I'm not a writer. Writers probably would be able to guide us better. You're chosen one and you appear at a certain point of time in history when things just fall into place. Language is there, काल है, परिस्थितियां हैं, सामाजिक हैं, पॉलिटिकल हैं, उन सबका जो सिनर्जी क्रिएट होती है, मुझे लगता है क्लासिक वहां से पैदा होती है। एक छोटी सी और बात, उसके बाद मैं तीन क्लासिक्स का ब्रीफली जिक्र करूंगा। हम सबने ये माना है कि क्लासिक एक इटर्नल टेक्स्ट है, टाइमलेस टेक्स्ट है, कालजयी टेक्स्ट है, जीवन जोगा टेक्स्ट, lives on, it never dies, it triumphs over time. I think it's also a text which has inherent capacity to travel across languages, across cultures. It has that capacity to break down all kinds of barriers. And I think that's exactly how this whole idea of world classics is constituted. Because you have texts coming in from different cultural contexts. from different languages, from geographical areas, and they have this ability to move on, to live on. As far as three different texts are concerned, Namita ji has made my task easier. She made a very pointed reference and I have picked it up, I picked the cue. The question that she was posing was whether we can think of Sri Guru Granth Sahib as a classic. When I think about three classics, Namita ji, I think I would like to start my discussion with Sri Guru Granth Sahib. And the reason for that is very simple. It is an embodiment of the best that has been taught, felt, and expressed in Punjabi language at one level. But that is not the reason why Sri Guru Granth Sahib is a classic for me. It is a classic for me because it actually gives us a picture of a composite culture. उसमें पंजाबी भी है, नानक की बानी भी है, कबीर की बानी भी है, नामदेव की बानी भी है, सब तरह की बानियों का सम्मिश्रण है श्री गुरु ग्रंथ साहिब और सबको इक्वल स्पेस दिया गया है. इट्स अ नॉन हेजेमोनिक टेक्स्ट. मुझे लगता है इसलिए वो एक क्लासिकल टेक्स्ट है. दूसरी टेक्स्ट जिसका जिक्र मैं करना चाहूंगा वो है वारिस शाह की हीर. It was written in 18th century at a time when Punjab was going through one of its worst political crises. That is the time Waris Shah comes and writes हीर. मैं ये कहने की कोशिश नहीं कर रहा कि हीर पहले लिखी नहीं गई है पंजाबी में. बहुत से वर्जन्स अवेलेबल हैं. I'm not going into the history. लेकिन what is so special about Waris Shah's हीर? 2 minutes, I'll sum it up. वो कहता है रांझा मुस्लिम है, लेकिन अगर आप उसकी एंसेस्ट्री देखते हैं तो वो राजपूतों तक ट्रेस की जा सकती है. Imagine a Muslim writer writing in 18th century at a time when Mughals and Sikhs were at war with each other. He actually is trying to trace the ancestry of a Muslim character back to Rajputs. And that's where I think the strength of Punjabi culture also resides. That's where the entire cultural tradition speaks to us. Yeah. Third text is Parsa. A little partial to it. Nirmal Kanti Bhattacharya ji knows about it. I did translate it at some point of time. I regard it as a cultural text precisely for the reason because cultural memory lives through that single text. Thank you.
We appreciate it. Yeah, you could go there. And Dipalaji talked about the germ of life, I think. And Kaggai literature and the place in history, what you said. It's interesting, yes, Shakespeare represented the Elizabethan age. It was larger than him. Now they've only been counting you to give something that sums up and makes sense of this perplexing title, which you would have to get all.
No, summing up will be done by you.
No, summing up meaning your thing will give deeper perspective. Because I know people are hungry for lunch.
I'll just begin by responding a little to Srinath again, as Ranaji also did. Considering his skepticism about the concept of classic, as I also am often confused which is a classic and which is not. And when I'm confused, I remember one interesting quip by Saint Augustine, who was asked, "What is religion?" And he replied, "If you ask me, I know not. If you don't ask, I know. So perhaps this is the yardstick we may have to, use in deciding which is a classic and which is a not. One which moves me, one which touches my life, a book which survives through ages, and the survival is not an easy job, as Namita mentioned about so much of water thrown to it. I like to dwell 1 minute on that topic. In Margaret Wood's Handmaid's Tale, and later in the Testament also, we have an imaginary land where reading is banned. Reading is totally banned, but for the ruling elite, the totalitarian elite who are ruling the country. For them, reading is allowed. For the rest of the people, reading is banned. So she was, obviously satirizing the whole concept of violating the classics, trying to burn the classics. We know what happened to her niece To Kill a Mockingbird. It was banned several times for racism, for sexuality, for rape. These are the reasons for which it was banned. But as a reader, we know that perhaps it is one of the strongest testament against the racial inequality. And perhaps it is one book which appeals to your sense of empathy in the loudest manner. But the book was banned from time to time. Coming to my choice very briefly, I'm not going to, I'm not going to create Indian classics right here. Maybe I was again a little confused with the title of the seminar. But for me, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is an all-time classic. Particularly when you live in the contemporary time. And what do we find in that book? We find that the life of the people is controlled by data, science, and technology. And the consumerism is so rampant that general public is benumbed by consumerism and succumb to the wishes of the powers that be. I often wonder that this book was written more than 90 years back. It is unbelievable. Secondly, as Namita mentioned, Shakespeare, and also she wanted us to tell a little about my own sphere of experience in study. So since I was a student of English literature, one Shakespearean play that really touched me was The Hamlet. As many of you, I'm sure, definitely will agree. I was always confused by what happened actually. Did he really see the ghost of his father? Or it was the hallucination of a mind which was already worked up, exercised because of the untimely death of his father. Why was he delaying? Was it procrastination, as Aristotelian theories would like us to believe as a fatal flaw? Or was it he was trying to find out a moral justification for taking another life? And then, was it really mad? Was it pretended madness, as the book tells us? Was it feigning madness? Or was this terrible experience was actually pushing him towards madness? Was he trembling on the boundary of sanity and insanity? Why did he treat Ophelia like this? At one point of time, we find great passion and love. At another point, we find cynical rejection. So this book, never ceased to raise questions in my mind. And every time I read, I find a new layer of meaning. And I in a kind of indefinable way, I feel perhaps I have inched a little forward toward the understanding of the novel. And the third novel, again very quickly I'll tell you, though you are reassuring me that I have time, is a Bengali novel called Jagori by Jyotinath Bhaduri. In English, it is called the Vigil. The Vigil has been published in English quite some time back. And yeah, it is during the time of the freedom movement. And the young revolutionary has been convicted, sentenced to death. The noble opens on a night, which was his last night. Next morning, he will be hanged. And there are 4 mesmerizing chapters in the novel. The story, the background story of the entire event is told by the convict himself, his father, his mother, both of whom are also in jail, and his brother who is not in jail. And we find 4 different views, a la maybe Rashomon, 4 different views of what exactly happened during this, build up to his arrest and conviction and sentence to death. And the family dynamics and the political turmoil, they interplay with each other and produce a kind of narrative which really keeps you, totally spellbound. And again, this is the beginning, which they said that perhaps one of the definitions of the classics can be that it yields new meaning every time you go out to it after 10 years. So this novel also, whenever I go back to it after 10, 15 years, I feel I have discovered new meanings and new interpretation. You cough on the mic when it is time, just cough on the mic. So I would end by just saying, sometimes, literary classics of the world and the Indian writing, sometimes Indian writing is influenced by world classics. I'll give you only 2-3 examples. Yesterday in a session, Guljarji was mentioning Navendu Ghosh, one of the scriptwriter and cinematographer of Demon Roy, and who himself later on directed in the movies. And then his daughter, Ratutama Sengupta, film journalist. She also spoke about her father's works, but mostly about film. But her father was also a writer. And I would believe that profoundly influenced by Mrs. Doloye of Virginia Woolf, he wrote 2 Bengali novels, Dak Diye Jai and Ajo Nagorer Kahini. And both these novels are written in the stream. It is the first Bengali novel written in the stream of conscious mood. So that I would consider the kind of influence of the literary classics of the world on Indian literature. The same applies to the woodpecker. Mini Krishnan is sitting there. There is a book by Shishendra Mukhopadhyay called Bhoon Puka. And it was written 5-6 years after the Latrenger of Albert Camus, the outsider, had attained a cult status as a modern classic. And then Shishendra Mukhopadhyay writes Bhoon Puka in Bengali, which I think the first Bengali novel where existentialism has been experimented upon. And later on the book was translated into English as the Woodpecker, and Mini Krishnan from Macmillan's translation series published it. So I think these are the interplays of classics influence on some of India. Thank you.
Thank you. That's been extremely good to hear 4 such different perspectives. And in your conversation, the new thoughts that I picked up was that in Aldous Huxley's case, for example, sometimes a classic is also prescient. It's ahead of its time. And then with Hamlet, ambiguity helps something to last longer because ambiguity means it can be reinterpreted even more easily over the ages. The third thought was that for a classic to survive, I think it's important for it to be retranslated every 20 or 25 years, because the classic may not be dated, but the translation might well be dated. And on all these thoughts, thank you for being a patient audience. I'm sorry we don't have time for any questions because 1 hour, as I was given it, already overrun that a few minutes. I'm a very strict person on timekeeping, and I'm sure the kitchen will not wait, and your stomach is applauding along with all these things. It's time for lunch. But do give a big round of applause to the classics.
It was indeed an interesting session. हम यहाँ पे
No, no, he wanted to make a concluding.
Yeah.
Namita, as I said, she is a very strict person. She is a very strict taskmaster also. But at the same time, at the beginning of the session, she asked us to have fun. So I was trying to have fun.
Yes, lunch is waiting and we are going to break for short lunch. पर उससे पहले धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करना चाहेंगे सेशन की अध्यक्ष महोदया नमिता गोखले जी को और हमारे सभी संवादियों को निर्मल कांति भट्टाचार्य जी, पॉल जकारिया जी, लाला नायर एंड श्रीनाथ पेरुल जी। थैंक यू सो मच। अब हमारी मुलाकात होगी 2:30 बजे और सेशन का टाइटल है मल्टीलिंगुअल शॉर्ट स्टोरी रीडिंग्स।